begin, can you hear me? I want to begin by celebrating two good friends who are no longer with us and whom I miss terribly. Both wrote about the civil rights movement, one a political historian, the other a poet. I'm referring to Bob Purdy and Seamus Heaney. In Politics in the Streets, his magisterial account of the origins of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, Purdy explains how the protests were a militant but constitutional challenge to unionist domination, to the injustice at the very heart of the state, political favouritism, gerrymandering, sectarian discrimination in housing and job favouritism, and job allocation. Purdy writes, if the grievances they were protesting about had been taken seriously by the Stormont and Westminster governments at an early stage, there would have been no need to take to the streets at all. And he concludes, the movement's vision was broader and more generous than any seen in Northern Ireland before. It inspired people who had lost faith in the possibilities of change, although it did not succeed in finding a way to bring change about. Bob Purdy was always totally committed to progressive politics and latterly to his religion. He was a devout Presbyterian. In my most recent collection, Angel Hill, I wrote a short elegy for him. It is called A Thistle, and I would like to read it now. On our walk to the hermit's caravan, you deftly divided with your penknife a thistlehead's miniature artichoke and presented me with its pinhead heart. Bob, could a hermit feast on thistleheads? True believer, hedgerow covenanter, oh, where is your radical penknife now? Thistledown covers your mouth and nostrils. In an article he wrote for the Sunday Tribune in September 1994, Seamus Heaney remembers the 1960s, the potential space opening up in both politics and literature here before everything changed utterly, to quote Yeats, before the whole kaleidoscope was violently shaken. And I quote Heaney. At that time, 60s, at that time, there was energy and confidence on the nationalist side and a developing liberalism as well as the usual obstinacy and reaction on the unionist side. There was a general upswing in intellectual and social activity. The border was more pervious than it had been, the sectarian alignments less determining. I remember in particular feeling empowered by a week on the road with David Hammond and Michael Longley in May 1968, when we brought a programme of songs and poems to schools and hotels and libraries in unionist and nationalist areas all over Northern Ireland. The programme was called Room to Rhyme. The title was taken from the opening verse of a mummers play that went, "Room, room, me gallant boys, and give us room to rhyme." A line that expressed perfectly the eagerness and impatience that was in the air at the time. I included in Angel Hill an elegy for Seamus and called it Room to Rhyme. I shall read 2 quatrains from it. Smashed after room to rhyme in Cushendall, we waded through heather stands to Fairhead and signed our names in barrow on Davy's shirt and launched it off the cliff into the wind. We drove after Bloody Sunday to join the Newry March. Roadblocks, diversions. Time enough to decide if we were asked at gunpoint, and what religion are you? I shall have more to say about this later in my talk. And my talk, which will be partly a poetry reading, is called Songs for Dead Children, Poetry in Violent Times, and I borrowed the title from Gustav Mahler's great song cycle, Kindertotenlieder. In August 1969, Patrick Rooney, a 9-year-old boy, was struck by a tracer bullet fired by the RUC as he lay in bed in the Divis Flats in the Falls Road, Belfast, in the Falls Road district of Belfast. He was the first child to be killed during the Troubles. In helpless response, I wrote Kindertotenlieder. Here it is. There can be no songs for dead children near the crazy circle of explosions, the splintering tangent of the ricochet. No songs for the children who have become my unrestricted tenants. Fingerprints everywhere, teeth marks on this and that. Patrick Rooney haunts me to this day. In the new book Angel Hill, I remember him in a short poem called Dusty Bluebells. Patrick Rooney, aged 9, was killed by a tracer bullet where he slept. Boys and girls in his class resumed their games soon after. In and out go dusty bluebells, Bangor boats away. In and out go dusty bluebells, Bangor boats away. The songs from the children's street games reverberate down the decades and sound in my imagination for the children killed in Manchester in May last year. The deaths of children, always innocent victims, epitomise the shame of political violence. When I wrote my poem Ghetto about the Holocaust, I found myself focusing on children. Here's the last section, which is about Terezin. Lessons were forbidden in that terrible school. Punishable by death were reading and writing and arithmetic, so that even the junior infants grew old and wise in lofts studying these subjects. There were drawing lessons and drawings of kitchens and farms, farm animals, butterflies, mothers, fathers who survived in crayon, until in pen and ink they turned into guards at executions and funerals, torturing and hanging even these stick figures. There were drawings of barracks and latrines as well, and the only windows were the windows they drew. I showed that long poem Ghetto to Helen Lewis, a survivor of Auschwitz and Terezin, and I was glad you mentioned her. Northern Ireland is not a place apart. Our civil war, which killed over 3,500 people, belongs to the dark history of European conflict. In writing about the Troubles, the poets of my generation took their bearings from Yeats and MacNeice, from the poems of Keith Douglas and Alan Lewis in the Second World War, from the great war poets Owen, Sassoon, Rosenberg, Blunden, Gurney, Edward Thomas. We read Brecht, Celan, Apollinaire, Montale, Akhmatova, Rosevich, and we reached back to Homer's Iliad. But from the outset it has been, and still is, hugely difficult, impossible even, to find in poetry a voice, as Heaney puts it, adequate to our predicament. In a poem called Wounds, which I wrote in 1972, I ask the ghost of my father what he makes of it all. He himself had joined up as a boy soldier in 1914 and fought in the trenches. Here's the poem's second section, where Patrick Rooney appears again. Now, with military honours of a kind, with his badges, his medals like rainbows, his spinning compass, I bury beside him 3 teenage soldiers, bellies full of bullets and Irish beer, their flies undone. A packet of woodbines I throw in, and Lucifer, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, paralysed as heavy guns put out the night light in a nursery forever. Also a bus conductor's uniform. He collapsed beside his carpet slippers without a murmur, shot through the head by a shivering boy who wandered in before they could turn the television down or tidy away the supper dishes. To the children, to a bewildered wife, I think, "Sorry, missus," was what he said. When the Bogside erupted in 1969 and West Belfast went up in flames, I was flabbergasted by the ferocity of it all. In the summer of 1969, Derek Mahan and I walked through the wreckage of the Falls Road. In a verse letter to him, I saw us as 2 poetic conservatives in the city of guns and long knives, our ears receiving then and there the stereophonic nightmare of the Shankill and the Falls. As I recalled in an interview I gave in 2003, part of me felt like an appalled outsider. Another part, anti-unionist, anti-establishment, felt exhilarated. The rest of me wanted to understand what I had hitherto ignored, the darkness and violence in my own community. From the beginning, my poet friends and I resisted the temptation to hitch a ride on yesterday's headlines, to write the poem of the latest atrocity. We learned from each other how complex the situation was, how inadequate the political certainties, Green Ireland, Orange Ulster. We knew there was no point in versifying opinion and giving people what they wanted to hear. We believed that poetry, the opposite of propaganda, should encourage people to think and feel for themselves. It should appeal to their generous instinct, as MacNeice said in the violent 1930s. We hated what we came to call troubles trash. We believed that even when generated by the best intentions, bad poetry about the sufferings of fellow citizens would be an impertinence. As part of an agenda, it would be a blasphemy. We disliked the notion that civic unrest might be good for poetry, and poetry a solace for the broken-hearted. We were none of us in the front line. So far as I can recall, we never discussed these dilemmas. We had no plans to face up to the crisis as a group or to speak to the outside world about it. We continued to write the poems that presented themselves, no doubt hoping that one day we might produce something adequate about the Troubles. I found that I wrote in 1971, too many critics seem to expect a harvest of paintings, poems, plays and novels to drop from the twisted branches of civil discord. They fail to realise that the artist needs time in which the raw material of experience may settle to an imaginative depth where it can be transformed into art. We took our time. Paul Muldoon observed that if you didn't write about the Troubles, you might be dismissed as an ostrich. If you did, you might be judged exploitative. Kieran Carson said that his poems were not necessarily about the Troubles, but might be of them. Introducing his indispensable anthology, A Rage for Order, Poetry of the Northern Ireland Troubles, Frank Ormsby wrote, "It is arguable that any poem by a Northern Irish writer since 1968, on whatever subject, could be termed a Troubles poem in that it may consciously or unconsciously reflect the context in which it was written." A French writer once asked me, which side are the poets on? But the true poets resisted demands to take sides. They listened to one another. In The Hill Farm, a beautiful lyric written before the recent Troubles, John Hewitt recalls standing outside a Catholic neighbour's home in the glens of Antrim, too shy to intrude, as they say the Rosary. At each Hail Mary full of grace, I pictured every friendly face clenched in devotion of a kind, alien to my breed and mind, easy as breathing, natural as birds that fly, as leaves that fall, yet with the sense that I still stood far from that faith-based certitude, here in the vast enclosing night, outside its little ring of light. Written during the Troubles, Seamus Heaney's The Other Side responds tenderly to Hewitt's poem and, reversing the situation, speaks from inside the house, from inside the Catholic community. Heaney evokes a Protestant neighbour standing outside their home as the evening prayers are being said. I shall quote the last 10 lines. But now I stand behind him. But now I stand behind him in the dark yard, in the moan of prayers. He puts a hand in a pocket or taps a little tune with the blackthorn shyly, as if he were party to love-making or a stranger's weeping. Should I slip away, I wonder, or go up and touch his shoulder and talk about the weather or the price of grass seed? These two poems explore the cultural intricacies of life in Northern Ireland. There are delicate balancing acts in the conversation between them. Perhaps such open-heartedness, reflecting generous instinct elsewhere in society, suggests why, despite the terrible violence, we never quite descended into the nightmarish mayhem of Bosnia's civil war. Poetic conversations continue to this day. When the Good Friday Agreement was painstakingly achieved, I felt it had, as it needed to have, an almost poetic complexity, and Paul's touched on this. To quote Heaney's metaphor, the agreement is about the price of grass seed. In a poem of my own, I call it a fragment from some future unimagined sky. A fragment from some future unimagined sky. You might say that today Northern Irish politics more often resembles bad prose. But the peace process is a process. It is far from over. It will take generations. In August 1994, it was rumoured that there might be an IRA ceasefire. At the time, I was reading the passage in the Iliad where the old king Priam bravely visits the mighty Greek general Achilles to beg for the body of Hector, whom Achilles has killed in action, in combat. Priam, in his fragility, awakens in Achilles memories of his own father and rekindles the gentler emotions he has had to suppress in order to be a general. The Iliad is probably our greatest poem about war and death, and this episode is for me its soul. I wanted to compress its 200 lines into a compact lyric and thereby make my own minuscule contribution to the peace process. I sent the resulting sonnet to the Irish Times. The then literary editor, John Manville, published Ceasefire on the Sunday of the week in which the IRA declared their ceasefire. I'll read the whole sonnet. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present home to Troy at daybreak. When they'd eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. In my imagination, I gave Priam the face of Gordon Wilson, the Enniskillen draper who was injured in the 1987 Enniskillen Remembrance Day